Dracula, the literary work by Bram Stoker about the bloodthirsty vampiric count of the same name, is one of the most iconic horror tales of all time. It also happens to be one of the most adapted pieces of literature out there, having been adapted into stage plays, television, comics, and especially film for many, many years. For as long as cinema has existed, Count Dracula has been portrayed by many renowned actors, such as Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, Gary Oldman, and Richard Roxburgh, just to name a few, and that's not even counting F.W. Murnau's unofficial adaptation of Stoker's work from 1922 titled Nosferatu and its subsequent remakes. Dracula has also been portrayed in a variety of lights, some that stay relatively true to the source, and others that stray pretty far from it. From a fiendish monster that uses his hypnotic presence and charisma to commit his reign of terror, to a supervillain seeking to reshape the world to his liking, to an anti-hero who becomes a vampire as a means to save and avenge his people. From the purest of pure evil to a figure of tragedy, it's safe to say that the Count has quite the resume as far as how he's been portrayed over his vast tenure in film. However, in the tumultuous year of 2023, the realm of cinema saw not one, but two iterations of the iconic Count, portrayed in varying ways. Both films, which feature Dracula in the role of antagonist, underperformed financially and critically, but they each have different goals in mind in terms of the types of films they set out to be, and they both stand as fairly unique entries in the eponymous Count's repertoire. And so, we're going to be examining these two films, which are none other than Renfield and The Last Voyage of the Demeter. This is your host, the Sea Monster, and I welcome you all to my essay video on these two films. So with that said, let's sink our teeth into this thing, shall we? So for starters, we're going to be taking a look at Renfield. Released in April 2023 and directed by Chris McKay, Renfield is a dark comedy slash action horror film focusing primarily on Dracula's bug-eating familiar, Robert Montague Renfield. The story puts emphasis on the thematics of toxic relationships, with the master-servant relations between Dracula, played by Nicolas Cage, and Renfield, played by Nicholas Hoult, being the template through which these thematics are explored. We see Renfield, who, after having to tend to the Count's bloodthirsty needs for decades, has reached a point where he wishes to break free from his master's control and go down a much better path for himself. While residing in New Orleans, he meets Rebecca Quincy, played by Awkwafina, a cop who intends to take down the city's local crime family, the Lobos, in order to get justice for her father, a police captain who was killed by said crime family, and the two eventually end up working together in order to defeat both the Lobos and Dracula. Renfield is a bit of a complicated film for me, but first, let's go over what the film has going for it. It's got a decent amount of entertainment value, from moments of humor that stand out, i.e., Renfield accidentally inviting Dracula into his apartment due to his doormat, to its action scenes, which deliver some pretty over-the-top and brutal but satisfying moments. And it has a cast that's fully committed to the material which they're working with. I mean, it goes without saying that Nicolas Cage is downright awesome as Dracula, where he's able to strike a nearly perfect balance between being morbidly funny and intimidating. We also have Nicholas Hoult of X-Men fame, who does a great job as our titular protagonist, exuding the sense that this character is a victim of the Count's will who is just desperately looking for a way out, only to eventually get the confidence he needs to overcome his master. And in terms of the story and what it's about, the film does well in exploring certain aspects that are found in a toxic relationship, such as manipulation and gaslighting. Dracula is able to emotionally manipulate Renfield into doing his bidding, like when he convinces him to save him from a group of vampire hunters at the beginning of the film by telling him that he's his only friend, with the word friend being in very big quotation marks. Later on, we see instances of Dracula making Renfield feel weak and inferior, and then we even see the former gaslight the latter by suggesting that he abandoned his wife and daughter when it was the Count that deceived him into becoming his slave in the first place after accepting the job to sell Carfax Abbey to the Count for money. All of this manipulation, which had gone on for decades, has resulted in Renfield being responsible for a path of bloodshed and death that is left in the Count's wake. And his guilt all comes to a head when, in trying to save a support group, he inadvertently spells their doom by bringing his master right to them. And so this exploration of thematics regarding toxic relationships and of taking back one's own willpower lends to Renfield undergoing a fairly well-executed arc where he's able to rediscover his self-worth, thus redeeming himself for having abandoned his family and for allowing Dracula to control him and to kill many innocent people over the years. In contrast to Renfield, we have Rebecca Quincy, who's shown to be incorruptible over the course of the story, finds herself in a position where, in order to save her sister, she has to join Dracula. However, she doesn't take the bait and instead tries to trick and kill the Count with sunlight. And prior to this, she's proof to Renfield that he can stand up for himself and take back his power. Neat stuff, I gotta say. There's also a clear love for Universal's classic iteration of Dracula based on the film's stylistic choice of detailing the origins of Dracula and Renfield's relationship as if it were like the 1931 film starring Bela Lugosi and Dwight Frye. And, as a Universal Monsters fan myself, I can't help but love and appreciate this stylistic choice. Considering how differently events in the 31 film played out as opposed to here, i.e. Renfield being killed by the Count for inadvertently luring Van Helsing and Harker to his lair in Carfax Abbey, it should be more than safe to say that Renfield, the film, isn't intended to be canon with the 1931 film in any capacity, but rather is in a continuity of its own. It's just that perhaps it could be seen as an alternate/parallel timeline where events play out similarly in some parts but wildly different in others. But still, I dig what I see here, and it certainly helps in giving the film a good amount of charm. So yeah, Renfield certainly isn't without its merits and entertainment factor. That being said, however, it also has some sloppy parts here and there which affect its overall writing quality in a pretty noticeable and significant way. There's also some weird bits here and there that don't necessarily pertain to the writing but are kinda worth addressing anyways. So with that said, let's just get into those. For instance, as great as Nick Cage is as Dracula for most of the film, the character is a bit of a goober in some parts. How so? Well, let's start with what he wants. Basically, Dracula's main motivation is to eat, drink, and be evil. Plain and simple. So, for a good chunk of the film, while in recovery from a prior bout with vampire hunters, he requires the blood of innocent people, so he sends Renfield out to fetch him a person or two. And it's noted that it has to be innocent people who are purely good or at least decent as opposed to evil people like serial killers or members of a certain crime syndicate. Because the Count only preys upon innocent people since he himself is, well, evil. So what I'm getting at here is that Dracula can't grow to full power or fully recover until he gets more of that good person blood down that vampiric gullet of his. Yet we clearly see him slowly but surely recovering anyways thanks to an abundance of blood packs that Renfield had to have acquired from various hospitals or other such sources, and we even see the Count sipping blood out of martini glasses in a couple of scenes. So it's kind of weird that Dracula is constantly pressuring Renfield into bringing him innocent people to drink blood out of when he seems to be recovering just fine as it is, to where near the end of the film he looks to be all set and ready to just go out on the hunt like he usually would. Also, since going back to full power and drinking the blood of innocents are the Count's motivations, it's odd and kinda dumb in a way that once he finds himself in a room full of innocent people to feast on, that being the support group, Dracula in this scene just goes full Freddy Krueger on the support group, tearing people's throats open with his hands, and doesn't drink any blood, or at least any blood that would make much of a difference. Yeah, just figured I'd point that out. Even though it does make sense for Dracula to slaughter all these people in order to punish Renfield, it's kinda silly that he doesn't even stop to drain the blood out of any one of these people for sustenance, just as he said he would earlier in the story. By Dracula's logic, Renfield in this scene would feel so powerless and would be so overwhelmed with grief and guilt that he wouldn't be able to step in and pull the Count away from whoever he chooses to drink from. And Dracula could easily leave in quick enough fashion before any police officers would arrive. So, there's that. Now these next couple of points are fairly small, but I do feel like I need to address them anyways. So I'd consider the action scenes to be entertaining and mostly well put together. The keyword being mostly. You see, the film is going for more pulpy sort of style in its depiction of violence, from people turning into geysers of blood when they die to moments like when Renfield uses a pair of disembodied arms on some bad guys like they're a pair of nunchucks, and even impales a couple of bad guys with those same arms. However, considering the gallons of blood that are shown to be spilled during these action scenes, especially during the set piece at the apartment complex, shouldn't our heroes, more specifically Renfield in this case, be covered almost from head to toe in blood, and perhaps be so a bit more consistently? I mean, given the amount of blood that's looking to be spewing out of people anytime he kills them or brutalizes them, he should be looking like a character out of an Evil Dead film by the end of this action scene. And yet, here we are. Look, as fun as these action scenes are, I would advise to not have this much blood to be rendered in CGI if it's not going to be properly translated in the live-action environment, i.e. fake blood being applied as makeup on some of our actors here. In fact, there's a moment where Renfield jumps down and stomps onto a bad guy hanging off a ledge to the point where the guy appears to be bisected and have all of his blood just explode out of his torso. But then once things start to die down, we could clearly see that same henchman's body, and there doesn't look to be any visible evidence that he was ever bisected or even had such level of damage inflicted on him. Now, this isn't necessarily the only issue in some of these action scenes, but I still thought it was worth noting that the film could have used a bit more consistency in the effects side of things. But anyways, moving into makeup, we have Dracula, who's depicted as having very pronounced and monstrous-looking vampire teeth all throughout the film, even when it would be very advantageous for him to not have them be so pronounced when he's supposed to be blending in with the crowd. Not only that, but I must admit that there are times where the teeth makes it just a bit too difficult for someone like me to know exactly what it is he's saying sometimes. It's even to the point where and I can imagine other folks out there, would feel the need to put subtitles on occasionally in order to understand exactly what he's saying. It's not to say that it happens all the time, but it's still just a bit too frequent for my liking. Perhaps a slight redesign for the teeth would have sufficed to take into account these particular issues. So, those are the less significant issues, which one could arguably pass off as nitpicks out of the way. Now, let's get into some real weak sauce here. First off, for some reason, despite Dracula having all that power and all those very useful abilities, i.e. turning into a cloud of fog which would enable him to go inside a person and make them go boom, essentially, he becomes quite stupid towards the end of the film by simply not using them, or even just simply killing our heroes quickly when it would have been advantageous and convenient for him to do so. I know that I've stated that Dracula is a bit of a goober in this film at certain points prior to the climax, but believe me when I say that this is where the character really falters in the writing side of things. For example, Dracula has Renfield basically down and out, and he has Rebecca at his mercy, as he grabs her and hovers directly above Renfield. Rebecca then goes on to shoot his foot, which would allow some blood to pour out and into Renfield's mouth conveniently, thus getting him back into the fight and saving her skin. If Dracula had grabbed Rebecca and simply moved just a couple inches away from Renfield, Rebecca would be done for and Dracula would have won. If Dracula wanted to kill Rebecca, why didn't he just do what he did to the bishop at the beginning of the film? Or, since it seemed to have worked on Renfield, who is a supernatural being like him, why didn't Dracula also kill Rebecca as a swarm of bats? Or better yet, if he really wanted to play into theatrics like he does here by not immediately killing her, why didn't he at least just disarm Rebecca before taking her up into the air? He has all that superhuman strength, which he would be very much aware of, yet he didn't think to just do that before having Rebecca at his mercy. Then, when Renfield gets back on his feet, why didn't Dracula just pull the fog thing on him? Dracula in this film is so overpowered that it's kind of ludicrous to see him just letting our heroes get the better of him like this, when they have no business in doing so just because the plot requires it. I'm telling you folks, this climax doesn't really hold up to scrutiny all that well. Secondly, and speaking of villains, the Lobos are also incompetent as far as being a powerful villainous faction is concerned. Their foot soldiers, as well as the cops that are all on their payroll, can't even hit the broadside of a barn, to where they all make your average stormtrooper from Star Wars look like a pure marksman. There is a point where Rebecca and the Lobos are all in a standoff in the middle of a street. Rebecca is surrounded, there's nowhere for her to go, there's like all sorts of guns pointed at her, and yet when she shoots up a utility pole, that's enough to allow her to escape from all those people trying to gun her down with only a bullet in her shoulder, as opposed to several bullets just covering her entire body, let's just say. So, remember when I say that the action scenes are mostly well put together? Well, the key word certainly is mostly, because even though there's some solid and badass moments when Renfield is in combat mode, there's also moments where bad guys don't shoot an easy target like Rebecca for no reason other than to give her time to spot and shoot them first, because otherwise she'd be dead several times over. Even though this can be blamed on poor editing or choreography, it still bleeds into how utterly stupid the Lobos really are as villains. And it's to a point where one can't help but wonder how this clown family of crime was even able to rise to power and prominence the way they did. Not to mention, since Rebecca, unlike Renfield, is clearly not supposed to be superhuman, we also have the issue of the Lobos being clearly stupid in order for her luck factor to be as off the charts like it is during certain set pieces, so that she could survive because, well, again, the plot requires it. On top of all that, Teddy and his henchmen get an upgrade from Dracula so that they'd be able to take on and defeat Renfield. But, despite having these power-ups and despite outnumbering Renfield, they all somehow fumble the ball and are not able to overwhelm the guy. They should be able to annihilate him, or at least hold him down so that Teddy could deliver a killing blow, yet here we are. All that power which the villains clearly have at their disposal, yet the day is saved by their low IQ level, I guess. Third of all, and this can be seen as an extension of my second point, the fact that the FBI, including Rebecca's sister, doesn't get more involved than they do is just strange, especially when Teddy Lobo and his men, who are all part of this infamous crime family, commit to more public crimes, like when they hold up an entire restaurant full of potential witnesses just to kill a single police officer, who is none other than Rebecca Quincy, who very much has a personal reason to want to take the Lobos down because of the fact that they killed her father, the police captain. There is so much witness testimony that can be mined from there that it should be more than enough to put the Lobos in very hot water with the FBI. If Rebecca's sister wants things to be done by the book in order for justice to be properly served, then Teddy Lobo threatening to kill a cop, let alone Rebecca of all people, in a public place with multiple witnesses would be more than enough for the FBI to step in to the point where they'd be able to supersede the PDNO's jurisdiction as well as, by extension, the Lobos' influence. So in short, the Lobos would be oh so screwed. And keep in mind, when this happens, we'd still be pretty early on into the story. So if Teddy was to be arrested and put under the FBI's custody, and if the Lobos were put under investigation this early into the plot, then the Lobos wouldn't meet Dracula, which means there's a potential for events to play out quite differently than they do here. So again, why doesn't the FBI have enough credence in order to step in any sooner than they actually do? Which is pretty late into the film, by the way, and more importantly, why would Teddy's mom even be okay with letting her son go out and kill Rebecca if the risks outweigh the reward by such a vast margin? Actually, wait a minute, Teddy's mother, who is the leader of this crime family, actually gave him the order to do this. So, hold on, why would she think that this is a good idea in the first place? Is she stupid? Okay, look. I get that Teddy isn't supposed to be the brightest bulb in the House of Lobo, but why does that have to mean that his mother is stupid too? Oh, one last thing here. I actually find it a bit strange that Rebecca is first shown to be relatively chill with witnessing a guy like Renfield just mopping the floor with Teddy Lobo and his goons during that fight scene in the restaurant, despite how grisly and over the top some of those kills were shown to be, to where she even says that he's a kind of a hero and that the city needs more people like him. It's even more strange when later on Rebecca is basically condemning him for being somewhat of a vigilante who kills people, bad people even, in ways that go past the bounds of being legal. No, she was shown to be kind of chill with him brutally kill these guys in the first place, regardless of whether or not he even gave the explanation that he was part of a military group or whatever. While the film does try to mitigate this issue by having Renfield trying to win back her trust after a conversation and after a battle in the apartment complex, it's still kind of odd that Rebecca seems somewhat flippant in this instance on her stance regarding vigilantism or people willing to stand up to bad people regardless of legal or societal norms. So basically, Renfield is very much a mixed bag. It has elements in its story and in some of its characters that are well executed, or at least mostly well executed, and it certainly has its share of entertainment value to keep it from being a total travesty to witness, but there's definitely enough wonky or even downright bad writing in how the plot plays out to where it brings down the objective quality of the film quite significantly. And in case if anyone were to suggest that since Renfield is meant to be a dark action comedy that isn't supposed to be taken too seriously, I'd like to point out that the film actually does take itself fairly seriously, such as when Dracula kills the support group and when the stakes, no pun intended, are at their peak during the film's climax. We've had plenty of films in the past that manage to have well-written plots while also being pulpy action comedies that are able to successfully juggle between various tones, between serious and not so serious. So what would make Renfield an exception here to where it could just get this sort of backhanded pass despite its sloppy execution in certain essential elements? Just a thought. Regardless, while I won't go as far as to call it terrible, Renfield certainly leaves a bit to be desired. So, having gone over a film like Renfield, which depicts Count Dracula and other related elements in a more comedic light, it only makes sense to cover the considerably darker and more serious one of the two films which we are currently covering here. And between the two, it may very well be the more overlooked film as well. Of course, for this section, we are gonna get into discussing The Last Voyage of the Demeter, which was released in August of 2023, 4 months after Renfield, and which was directed by André Øvredal. The film is primarily based on one chapter in Bram Stoker's original novel, Chapter 7 to be exact, titled The Captain's Log. The plot of The Last Voyage of the Demeter tells the tale of, well, the Demeter's voyage to England, which also ends up being its last voyage, where Dracula, played by Javier Botet, has secretly stowed away in. Going forward, we see the ship's crew and a new member/passenger named Clemens, played by Corey Hawkins, find themselves all basically on the menu, where they all get killed by the vampire one by one, night by night. And so Clemens, the crew, and Dracula's former captive named Anna, played by Aislinn Franciosi, have to figure out how to slay the vampire before the Demeter could arrive at its destination. Of course, for anyone who's read the novel or have seen any other version of Dracula which involves this particular plot point, it's very apparent where the story is going to go. However, just because one knows how the story is going to end, that doesn't necessarily mean that the story itself can't be good and be well told. So, with that said, let's take a look, shall we? Now, if the plot sounds even vaguely familiar, well, that's because, admittedly, it is. The Last Voyage of the Demeter bears quite the amount of similarities to the 1979 sci-fi classic known as Alien, in that the plot pretty much goes as follows. A cargo ship is on a voyage where it unknowingly carries a deadly powerful force that has stowed itself away in the ship and amongst the crew. The crew finds itself on this creature's menu over the course of the voyage, and so the last remaining members of the ship have to expel the evil before it reaches its destination, with only one crew member left living to tell the tale. Now, of course, unlike in Alien, spoilers in Alien, where the Xenomorph was successfully expelled out an airlock by Ripley towards the end of that film, Dracula lives to the end of this film, and so Clemens has to go and hunt him down in England. This has been highlighted as a criticism towards The Last Voyage of the Demeter due to how its premise alone is similar to Alien. Now, it's not to say that this film is as good as Alien, I certainly won't go that far, but just because a film is similar to another film in terms of premise and how its plot plays out, that shouldn't necessarily be a mark against The Last Voyage of the Demeter in its own right, because the conceit of its premise does call for its plot to play out this way. The film does have its share of problems, that much is certain, but it being similar to another movie isn't one of them. Is that clear? Good? Good. Anyways, moving right along. The cast does a great job all around, from Corey Hawkins as Clemens and Aislinn Franciosi as Anna to David Dastmalchian as the first mate Washcheck, and especially Liam Cunningham, Sir Davos from Game of Thrones, as Captain Elliot. And the characters, while not the deepest, offer enough solid material in the writing side of things for the cast to chew on. Clemens is a man who seeks to make sense out of the world as it is for all its misgivings. He seeks to understand why things are the way they are, given the prejudice he's faced in his pursuit of a career as a doctor due to the color of his skin. And he finds himself put to the ultimate test in that regard once he encounters something like Dracula, whose mere existence defies the laws of reason and nature as one may know them. And so Clemens goes on to vow to avenge the crew of the Demeter and Anna by hunting Dracula down, and to potentially take part in later chapters of Bram Stoker's Dracula, like, let's say, perhaps teaming up with Van Helsing, which we're more than likely never going to see, sadly, at least in this particular iteration of the story. Anna, a village girl from Romania who was discovered by Clemens in the cargo hold, serves as a harbinger of sorts who is forced to become Dracula's slave after being sacrificed to him by her village, who warns Clemens and the crew of what they're all dealing with and the capacity for evil that the vampire is capable of demonstrating. She goes on to fight back against Dracula and is able to free herself from his will, to where she lets herself die in sunlight at the end of the film in order to save herself and Clemens from the vampire's curse that remains in her. In terms of the crew, we have Captain Elliot, who is shown to be dutiful and steadfast, but caring for his crew, and especially for his grandson, Toby. He's the character who goes through the biggest emotional gauntlet out of everyone, because he loses not only men whom he's come to call close colleagues or even friends, but then he loses Toby, which ultimately cripples him to where he falls out of lucidity due to the grief that's culminated up to this point. It takes Clemens and Anna reasoning with him in order for Elliot to go onward and try to stop Dracula from getting to his destination, even if it means costing the captain his ship and his life. The rest of the crew serve pretty well as a decently sized and well-characterized cast of side characters whom we spend just enough time with just to get to know before the vampire starts slaying them all, so that when certain horrors are inflicted upon them, we as an audience are able to care about them. Even when some of them aren't the greatest sort or the most likable of characters, like one crew member, for example, who antagonizes Clemens earlier in the film by accusing him of having something to do with the livestock all ending up dead, and even calls him a racial slur because of that. Certain other characters like Washcheck, Ogarin, and Toby have just enough going for them character-wise to where one can't help but feel bad for them when they each start meeting their end. And when it comes to Dracula, the film does a good job at not only portraying him as a bloodthirsty, ravenous monster with great power, but also as a devilish force whose shadow looms over the Demeter, leaving its crew in a state of total despair. For instance, after Toby is killed, Captain Elliot is in a state of grief and desperation to bring his grandson back, and so Anna and Clemens have to convince him that Dracula would only deceive the captain into believing that Toby would return, when in reality, he would only get an insidious vampiric husk, as we were shown a few scenes prior. Dracula is characterized as being nothing short of pure evil, taking pleasure in hunting and killing his victims to the point where he even toys with said victims before killing them. Like when Ogarin says please no, Dracula, as he's creeping up towards him, repeats those words right back at him with an evil grin on his face. Not to mention, Javier Botet does a great job in terms of giving Dracula a creepy physicality and a sense of personality, even subtly so. From how the character moves when he's at low power, when he's like in a sort of Gollum-looking state, let's just say, to how he savors the act of leaving his victims in a state of torment, helplessness, and suffering before he bites into them and literally drains them of life. And whereas Nicolas Cage's Dracula in Renfield calls back to Universal's classic version of the character, Botet's Dracula in this film calls back to the Count's iteration known as Orlok in F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, showing that film's legacy still lives on after over 100 years. In The Last Voyage of the Demeter, Anna describes Dracula as a monster who assumes the form of a man. This emphasizes the sheer horror of the Count being a shadowy force that could walk amongst society should he be allowed to, and inflict his terrible will and satisfy his hunger as he wishes. This conversation between her and Clemens about Dracula cements the fact that the vampire is an evil that wears the mask of humanity in order to enact his nightly prowls, which we as an audience can see for ourselves being the case in those other iterations of the Count, while this film pretty much makes this fact all the more definitive. That being said, however, one thing that I can't help but find to be a bit amusing is that once we see Dracula in the final scene of the film where he's looking all Orlok-like, I can't help but ask, how in the hell is Dracula in this film gonna be able to trick or seduce anybody, especially when he looks like a literal monster, and especially when it's not known whether or not he can even hypnotize people into thinking that he looks anything but like a literal monster. I guess we are supposed to assume that he does have such an ability, and it's just that the Voyage didn't necessarily require it. But such a theory can only reach up to the extent of it being headcanon or it needing a sequel for validation, and, well, I'm not exactly up for headcanon being a valid defense, and given the film's poor reception both critically and financially, a sequel to it seems to be very unlikely, if not an impossibility. But even so, there's still enough good character work at play here to where both the film's drama and its horror are allowed to be all the more effective. Now, in terms of a thematic core, it's not the most deeply explored of themes, but the one that's most apparent in this film is how one has to move forward and persevere even in the darkest of times. In order to overcome such a state of dread and despair, the crew of the Demeter has to move forward and do the best they can in order to destroy the evil which is slaying them, such as how Wojciech has to let the Demeter go down to the depths, despite coming to call it his home if it means stopping Dracula by putting him in a deep-sea grave, or how Captain Elliot has to accept that Toby can't be brought back and that he has to only remember him as he was in life. And as for Clemens and Anna, Clemens is fighting to understand his new powerful adversary so that he can kill him, while Anna has been in a state of despair for her whole life back in her village as well as in Dracula's clutches, and so we see her overcome that despair in order to help the others stop Dracula. The people on the Demeter all have to overcome their states of despair in order to go onward and defeat the ultimate evil, even if it means that they have to give their lives themselves in order to achieve such a victory. Again, it's not the most heavily explored thematic core, but it's still rather apparent, and the film does well in bolstering it in a coherent and mostly well-executed manner. So, up to this point, I've been giving this film a good amount of praise for the most part, and rightfully so, because I do consider this film to be worth praising in several aspects, while still keeping that praise as fairly reserved as possible. That being said, however, I do want to bring up some issues that I have with it. Now, the weird thing about this film is that much like Renfield, there are similar instances where Dracula doesn't utilize his powers or abilities very well during the climax, as well as the fact that certain parts of the climax don't quite hold up to scrutiny. Maybe not to the same extent as Renfield, but still. While the film doesn't establish something about Dracula as plot-breaking as an ability for him to turn into a cloud of fog that could kill people by exploding them from the inside, there are still instances where this version of Dracula just doesn't kill Clemens or Anna when it would be advantageous for him to do so. In fact, Clemens and Anna go on to demonstrate a use of plot armor when Dracula just throws them around or entrap them with his wings, as opposed to committing to a quicker and more lethal method of attack, especially when, by this point, he's basically at full power. Also, whether it's through the power of editing or through a plot contrivance, Dracula doesn't seem to notice the part of the mast coming down and towards him, which is meant to pin him down, considering that all he has to do is quickly fly out of the way. Granted, it doesn't amount to much in the end because he's able to push that part off of himself once the Demeter makes landfall, so he's able to live to see another night. However, it's odd that Clemens and Anna would even think that this was going to kill him or set things in motion for him to be killed. In fact, come to think of it, why didn't Clemens and Co. have it to where the boat is steering away from the mainland, so that it would be harder for Dracula to escape much more easily? Given how heavy that part of the mast was and how it was able to pin Dracula down the way it does, the only thing that caused Dracula to be able to escape was the Demeter making landfall. Basically, the impact of the ship beaching itself was what gave Dracula the leverage he needed to free himself. By having the ship being turned away from shore, Clemens and Co. would have at least potentially a surefire win in trapping Dracula and preventing the ship from reaching its destination before it could sink into the ocean. The crew of the Demeter have devised this very dangerous, borderline suicidal, but still viable plan of trapping Dracula on a sinking ship, yet they overlook the fact that they could just steer the ship away from where England is. Why? Because we have to make sure Dracula's plot armor remains intact so that he could survive, so that Clemens could chase him down in England in a future story. And we also can't have the story end by having everyone, including Clemens, all die so that Dracula could have a clean victory like he does in the novel / other iterations, arriving in England on a Demeter with no survivors. Now this issue here is why I understand where certain critics are coming from in terms of it deviating from the source material. It's an issue because in order for Clemens to be the surviving member of the Demeter, the plot has to have its characters commit to trying to kill Dracula in a way that would still ensure the vampire a victory by the end of the story, but the plot also has to ensure that Clemens comes out alive, despite the conceit of this particular chapter of the novel being that the Demeter became a ghost ship with no survivors by the time it arrived in England, thanks to the vampire feasting on all of the crew. Basically, this is a pretty problematic climax upon closer inspection, I will admit. Now going out of order just a bit here, earlier in the film, Toby, before he's hunted by Dracula and the zombified Ogarin, is totally aware of something dangerous being on board the ship, going around and attacking / killing the crew, especially since he's the one to have discovered Ogarin covered in blood and strung up like a Halloween decoration. So what would give Toby any incentive to leave the captain's quarters and go on his own without any consideration to knock on wood for his grandfather or at least another crew member to escort him around or to check out the sound of a zombified Ogarin freeing himself? Or potentially freeing himself at least. Well, to answer that for the film, if he didn't go on his own, then he wouldn't be in a harrowing situation where he would be alone and helpless once Dracula comes around. But even if we are to chalk this up as Toby being a kid who doesn't know any better for one reason or another, why didn't Clemens or Elliot or any other crew member around that area and at the time think to just grab the gun that's clearly on the floor and shoot the lock off in order to get Toby out of there more quickly before Anna could end up being the one to do it? While the scene isn't necessarily as egregious in terms of being a flawed set piece as the climax, considering that there was potential for Dracula to get Toby no matter what happened, which would ultimately lead to the tragic payoff of a vampire Toby being dumped into the sea, it's still kinda strange that this film has such solid set pieces involving suspense cranking up until a horrifying payoff happens where the vampire brutally murders a victim, only to have some set pieces which seem to do away with logic when the plot requires it. So yeah, The Last Voyage of the Demeter isn't what I would call a great piece of vampire cinema. But even with its issues in mind, I still wouldn't call it a bad entry in the Dracula mythos either. In fact, I would say that it's fairly solid for the most part. It's well made in the technical side of things, from some neat cinematography to a great use of the authentic looking set design in order to add to the suspense during certain scenes. There's some admittedly not great green screen here and there, but not enough to tank the film, and while there's instances where the CG enhancements on Dracula become a bit too overbearing, especially during the final act, there's enough good practical work on him to where it allows him to look like a genuinely creepy beast of the night. And in terms of how the writing is executed here, while there are some hiccups which are there as a means to facilitate certain scenes to play out the way the plot requires them, there's enough in the writing that's well executed beyond that, from the characters to the horrific and or tragic events which they all go through, in order to keep The Last Voyage of the Demeter afloat. So it's pretty interesting to see how two films based on Dracula could be released in the same year, each taking a different approach on the material which they're based on. It's even more interesting to see how each of these films come to be what they are in terms of overall quality. Renfield has good things going for it, but it still falls frustratingly short of being good overall, while The Last Voyage of the Demeter is held back from being really good, but is still able to keep itself together and be fairly solid overall. I do consider the latter to be the better of the two in terms of overall quality, but that doesn't mean I would actively recommend against anyone giving the former a watch. Both films, despite being so overlooked as far as works of cinema from 2023 are concerned, and despite their flaws, have something to bring to the table in the ever-growing legacy of Dracula films, with Renfield being a darkly comedic tale about destructive and toxic relationships that pays tribute to Universal's classic incarnation of the character while carving out a signature of its own, and with The Last Voyage of the Demeter being an atmospheric, suspenseful horror tale focusing on a chapter in the original novel that's only been just touched on and not fully illustrated in grisly detail, while also paying tribute to the first ever iconic iteration of Dracula, without said tribute becoming too heavy-handed. And even with the former being a mixed bag and the latter being not quite as strong as it could have been, I'm personally glad that they both exist, and I'd recommend people to, at the very least, give them a watch through for themselves. And with all that said and done, I think it's safe to seal the coffin shut and draw this video to a close. I would like to thank you all very much for watching, and I hope you all found it to be worth the spooktacular time. Be sure to follow me on here for what I have in store, whether it be essay videos or live stream shenanigans. Once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you all later. Happy Halloween.